All right. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for assembling with us this morning to discuss an issue that is weighing heavily on many Georgians' minds. I'm Senator Elena Parent and proud to represent the 42nd Senate District and serve as the chairwoman of the Senate Democratic Caucus. Alarm bells are sounding around the country right now, and for very good reason. Time and again, legislators and our courts are mandating that reproductive medical care conform to certain religious views and not to long-established medical standards of care. The Dobbs decision we now see was really just the beginning, although what a beginning it was, landing with all the force of an earthquake around the United States as women saw a right that they had held for 50 years evaporate with the stroke of Justice Alito's pen. Currently in Alabama, chaos is unfolding as the Alabama Supreme Court altered the medical landscape with a truly radical decision that frozen embryos created outside of a human body are deemed to be human children under law that cannot be discarded. Contraception itself, the beginnings, the foundation of family planning, is a target of an extremist right-wing agenda, and this battle is unfolding on many fronts. How do we know this? Justice Clarence Thomas voiced support in his concurrence in the Dobbs case overturning Roe v. Wade for also overturning Griswold versus Connecticut, the seminal 1965 decision that gave couples a right to the use of contraception for their family planning. In the U.S. House of Representatives, 195 members, 90% of them members of the Republican Party, voted against the Right to Contraception Act in July of 2022. They would not take that vote to affirm the right to contraception. Senators Mike Braun of Indiana and Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee have both indicated publicly that they believe that decisions about contraception should be left to the states and no longer be a fundamental American right. The majority of Americans are concerned about these flashing warning signs on further government intrusion into their family planning. The Heritage Foundation, an influential right-wing think tank, has called for a feminist movement against the pill. For those that are not yet alarmed, one only need look at the certainty many felt that the Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade would always allow the right to abortion for women across the country. One only need look at that to realize that taking these things lightly is a huge mistake. So yesterday, I filed two bills to address reproductive health care. The Right to Contraception Act will codify our right to choose when we start or expand a family. The Right to IVF Act will codify that a human egg or fertilized human embryo outside of a human uterus is not considered a child or minor under state law for any purpose. And the truth is, I filed these bills not out of a sense of hysteria or to score political points. Our neighboring state has taken radical action that have thrown the family planning efforts of millions of thousands of couples in Alabama who are desperately seeking the opportunity to be parents into question, potentially crushing their dreams of being able to be moms, be able to be dads, to have children, to add to their family. Georgians need certainty to know that that level of terror will not be inflicted upon them. Going through the process of trying to expand your family through IVF is already physically and emotionally draining. Feeling like that opportunity could be ripped from you at any moment, especially when there's great cost to undergoing that type of assisted reproductive technology, is not the type of emotional roller coaster I want Georgia couples, women, men to face or be afraid of. Probably right now, there are couples here in Georgia questioning whether they should spend the money to embark on that journey, knowing that that ability could be ripped from them at any time. I am very concerned, though, that our Republican colleagues here in the state Senate simply do not agree about what we view to be fundamental rights to family planning that are standard medical care. I invited everyone in the Georgia State Senate to sign on to both of these bills yesterday. I saved spots for my Republican colleagues so that they could sign on in the top 5 to show their support, to demonstrate that these are bipartisan values. These are things that the vast majority of Americans and Georgians agree on. I kept them at my desk for several hours waiting for Republican co-signatories, and none were forthcoming. So in the end, I filled in with other caucus members of mine, who Democratic senators whose values are firmly aligned with allowing Georgians reproductive freedom. So that makes the warning signs flash even more strongly to me, that not one of my colleagues was willing to say, I support IVF. I support the right to contraception. Here's the deal. Georgians have the right to health care, to reproductive health care, and to contraception and family planning tools. And any restriction on this access is dangerous because it prevents people from making choices that affect their physical, mental, economic health, and well-being. These rights are sacred, and this should not be a partisan issue that is used to play games with constituents' lives and the families that they are hoping to build. So with that, I would love, I have the honor of being able to bring up my good friend and a whip-smart lawyer, Representative Marvin Lim.
Thank you, Senator Parent. So, like a good lawyer, I will start with the law, as she did. One of the many far-reaching implications of Dobbs is that the Supreme Court explicitly called into doubt the case that my colleague, Senator Parent, named, which was Griswold v. Connecticut, which came in 1965 before Roe, and that was almost 60 years ago now. That did establish that there is a constitutional right to privacy that prevents any government from restricting access to contraception. Because we have been taken back almost 60 years, and because, again, the threat to this right is not imaginary, but it is very real. Senator Parent mentioned what has happened at the U.S. congressional level. And I should also point out that several states have also passed, or at least attempted to introduce bills that try to ban access to contraception. That is why I stand here with my colleagues today as a proud sponsor of the Georgia Right to Contraception Act, which enshrines this law in our state law. I will say that as a Catholic who is originally from the Philippines, I was taught and know quite well at this stage the Aquinian natural law teachings on this matter. Yet even the Philippines in 2014, I will note, one of 2 countries in the world besides the Vatican that continue to outlaw divorce, managed to pass a law guaranteeing universal and free access to modern contraception. Unfortunately, we in America seem to be moving in the opposite direction. We cannot stress enough how critical access to contraception is for all people, including men like myself, who must bear great responsibility in both family planning and generally sexual and reproductive health. We know for a fact that contraception reduces rates of unintended pregnancies, reduces the need for abortions, which again is especially critical because of Dobbs, reduces HIV transmission to newborns, promotes maternal and infant health, something we've been talking a lot about here in the Georgia General Assembly, and reduces sexually transmitted infections. These are all facts, period, borne by evidence time and again. And these are things that, along with all people, again, including men like myself, should care about because of the responsibilities we bear. And to the extent that so many men, unfortunately, do see contraception as primarily a woman's responsibility, it only underlines that any restriction will, accounting for the realities of human behavior, become that much more of a deterrent to access. We also know that contraception is particularly critical in all respects to minority and low-income communities, like my district, which is comprised of almost 50% immigrants like myself and 25% of people in poverty. These communities are disproportionately burdened by sexual and reproductive health challenges, in part because of existing disparities with contraceptive use and non-use, which extends to both education and access to these services and goods. So access to education, cultural influences, other factors do account for these existing disparities, yet regardless of the reasons, it is again clear that any restriction at this stage will become exponentially more of a deterrent to the critical access we need across races, across genders, and yes, across political divides. All of this is why we have introduced the Georgia Right to Contraception Act, which in the House is House Bill 1424. The threat is too grave and too real not to act. And with that, I'm proud to turn it over to my co-sponsor, Representative Terry Anulowicz.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here today. I will never forget that night here in the General Assembly when House Bill 481, the so-called heartbeat bill, passed out of the chamber. I spoke against it along with many of my colleagues. We fought hard. But what sticks with me the most, what comes back to me when I think about that night, and I think about that night often, was being in the anteroom, listening to the discussion, and having Republican colleagues, I say colleagues because it was more than one, say to me, you guys don't need to worry. I know you're upset about this, but we don't want to be primaried if we vote against it. And don't you know that Roe will never be overturned? Don't you know that Roe will never be overturned? And I will tell you, so many of us believed that in our bones, that right to control our bodies, that right to bodily autonomy was something that could never be taken away. But y'all, we were wrong. We were wrong. Women are suffering. Families are suffering because so many people were wrong when we actually thought that right was something that we would be able to keep. And now we have seen what's next, right? Justice Thomas has no illusions. And he's not unique. So many of these Republicans have no illusions. This is about controlling women. And one of the best ways you can control women is by controlling their bodily autonomy. You control whether and when they are able to reproduce. And that is what we are saying. We know that these rights are fragile. And I will tell you, don't be surprised to hear that any Republican thought that Roe might never be overturned because they didn't want it to be overturned, because most people, most Georgians, poll after poll after poll tells us that most Americans do support access to reproductive health care. They have no problem with contraception because so many people know that contraception is health care, right? I take the pill right now, not because I'm trying not to have babies. That ship has long since sailed, but because I'm in perimenopause. And ladies, it's awful. It's awful. So if I can try to control some of the things my body is doing with contraception, I am going to take advantage of that opportunity because science is a miracle. And we know, that's probably the quote that'll be run. We know that our reproductive rights are fragile. We know that IVF is on the chopping block, and we know that it is just a matter of time for contraception. It is not a question of if, but when. We know this. So being able to sponsor this legislation is something that is so important to me as a Georgian, as a woman, as a mother of a teenage girl who's dealing with her own, learning about the joys of being a woman and all the things that come along with that. This is important. This is important for Georgians. I also approached Republican colleagues to ask if they would be willing to sign on to this, because we do know, right? The numbers tell us, the polls tell us that this is an issue that has overwhelming support. And there's that quiet support, right? There's that secret support. There are people where if this comes to a vote on the floor, they might take a walk instead of voting no or instead of voting yes. We know that support is there, and it was disappointing, but honestly not surprising that no Republicans have decided to sign on, even though I know that they are getting the same emails I am getting from women from families in their district who are sharing their stories of why IVF is so important to them, of why contraception is so important to them, of why it is a critical healthcare resource that we must ensure every Georgian has access to. And so I'm very happy to support this legislation. I'm glad we are doing this in Georgia. It is an honor to be a part of this. And I'm not a lawyer, so I can't talk about the legal things. I can talk about some of the cultural things, though, because I am also a Catholic, and I am a mother, and I am someone who has made these own decisions for myself. And I tell you, there are no monoliths in politics. We know this, right? And the majority of Catholics support access to contraception. I mean, these are just things that we know. These aren't surprising statistics. They're not new statistics. These are things that we know that we continue to affirm with new polling. So now I want to actually introduce Alicia Stallworth. Thank you so much for being here with us, because we have these advocates who have been fighting and working for this also. We are going to be in the well speaking about this. We'll be talking to our colleagues about this, and we've got these armies of advocates who are also ready to help us in this fight. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Alicia Stallworth. I am the Southeast Campaigns Director for Reproductive Freedom for All, formerly known as NARAL Pro-Choice Georgia. I want to thank the sponsors of this legislation for taking this stand alongside of us and really trying to codify the right to contraception, because we know that our rights are at risk. Like, we've been ringing this bell for over 7 or 8 years within our reproductive bubble. And we've been saying this for a long time, that they are coming for all of our rights. So it's an honor to speak to you all today alongside these champions. It has been nearly 2 years since the Supreme Court handed down the decision Dobbs v. Jackson, Women's Health Organization, and ended the constitutional right to abortion. That ruling not only gave the green light to anti-abortion extremists to begin enforcing bans, but it also sent a clear and terrifying message to Americans. Our freedom to determine if, when, and how to start or grow a family is on the line. And you've heard the legislators say this over and over again, because ultimately that's what's at stake. In his concurring opinion in Dobbs' decision, Justice Thomas even went as far as to call on the court to overturn its precedent affirming the right to contraception. And for some reason, this was like a wow to most Americans. But again, it's all intertwined. You see, we know that those hostile to abortion never intended to stop with ending Roe. The same extremists working harder than ever to roll back abortion rights and access are also targeting our other fundamental freedoms, including access to birth control. And as recent Alabama Supreme Court decision shows, IVF. They don't care that Americans support reproductive freedom, including birth control. Brian Kemp and extremist Republicans like him were never going to stop at banning abortion. Shortly after the Dobbs decision, Governor Kemp was caught saying he was open to banning birth control. Polling shows that the overwhelming majority protecting legal access to contraception and that the voters are concerned about states restricting it. We did a polling in 2022, September of 2022, that showed 94% of Georgians supported access to birth control. At the national level, Republicans in Congress have nearly shown their hand by blocking efforts by Democrats to protect birth control. 195 House Republicans voted against the Right to Contraception Act, and Senate Republicans ultimately blocked it after it passed the House. The Dobbs decision affirmed that these actions are unrelated. They are not empty threats. These are promises to an increasingly extreme minority that will continue to reward them with power. There's no time to waste. We must act now to protect access to contraception here in Georgia. If we keep fighting, freedom will prevail. The people of Georgia are with us. Together, all of us are the majority. And together, we can build the future we want to live in. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm passing it on to Dr. Lisa Zeman. Thank you.
Thanks. It's an honor to stand with the legislators, the lawyers, the advocates. I'm representing healthcare professionals and the women and couples I see every week navigating economic hardship and challenges to access medical care as is. We don't want to burden them anymore. I am Dr. Mimi Zeman, an OBGYN and co-author of 16 editions of a medical guide called Managing Contraception. Contraception is a critical cornerstone of public health, economic stability, and individual freedom. When couples can plan their families, children brought into the world have the best opportunity to thrive. That's why we must pass the Georgia's Right to Contraceptive Act. Survey after survey show that over 90% of adults support the availability of contraception. This overwhelming consensus underscores the importance of contraception to people on the right and the left. Contraception is essential not only for family planning, but also for managing various health conditions like menstrual bleeding disorders. As we've seen with abortion restrictions, there were repercussions for the care of miscarriages. Similarly, if contraceptive access is limited, then treatment of all other gynecological conditions will be affected. And for those people motivated to reduce the number of abortions, the most effective way to do that is increase access to contraception. In a study conducted in St. Louis, when no-cost IUDs and contraceptive implants were made widely available, abortion rates in the city plummeted to less than half the national rates. In the state of Colorado, a family planning initiative that made these same methods affordable resulted in a 50% drop in teen births and abortions, saving the state $70 million. So why are contraceptives under a threat? In the name of religious beliefs. Years ago, the Supreme Court cited religious freedom to allow a private company, Hobby Lobby, to deny insurance coverage for birth control. A later ruling broadened exemptions to include publicly traded companies, private institutions, nonprofits, universities, and other employers claiming religious or moral objection to contraception. These religious groups believe life starts at conception when a sperm fertilizes an egg, forming an embryo. Let's talk about embryos for a minute because they've been in the news. They consider the failure of an embryo to implant as loss of life, or as was ruled in Alabama last week, the loss of an unborn child. They argue incorrectly that certain birth control methods prevent embryos from implanting, thereby increasing loss of life. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the use of any birth control method prevents fertilization and therefore prevents loss of embryos. It's when couples do not use contraception that many more embryos are formed and then eliminated from the body. Around 60% of embryos formed are passed when no contraceptive method is used. Therefore, anyone holding religious beliefs about embryos deserving protection should actively support the use of all birth control methods. They should support this bill, and doing so would actually be more in accordance with their values of protecting life. Women will be the beneficiaries of greater health care access, not less. Couples will be able to plan their families and bring children into the world when they are ready. As an OBGYN practicing in Georgia post-Dobbs, I've seen firsthand how people are suffering. There's no place in our exam rooms for legislators to restrict access to essential health care. It's our duty as citizens to protect and expand this access, ensuring every Georgian can make personal health decisions in accordance with their own values and their own religious freedoms, and without political interference or the imposition of someone else's religious beliefs. Thank you. Senator Parent.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zeman, for that firsthand account. We are happy to take a few questions, if anyone has any.
First,
There you go.
obviously crossover day is tomorrow.
Yes.
Are you expecting to get this done before this session, or is it setting the stage for?
Well, I did, a great question. I did have a conversation with the Majority Leader Gooch about that yesterday. And he said, well, we wouldn't be able to move on that this year. And I noted that they have introduced a number of immigration-related measures that they are intending to move on this year. So I pointed that out to him. So anyway, there is no obstacle to actually moving on that this year for those that need the rest of it to be tied together. What? Sorry, Raul is next, and then we'll get over to you. Yeah.
Bringing it back to state law, and Georgia law. What is it in Georgia law that you believe would lead to an Alabama scenario? Because the law is being different. What is it in Georgia law that's raising the concern, specifically around IVF and the Alabama decision?
I'll say something first, and then if anyone else wants to weigh in. I mean, from my perspective, our code is riddled with all kinds of places where there are question marks. And therefore, we need this strong, very clear, very simple statement that embryos outside of a uterus are not children. You know, 481 is a bit confusing in that regard. It has some language that would seem to be protective, but other language where, you know, we could start to have tax exemptions. And the thing is, you know, the Republicans have to confront, are they really going to maintain this belief that life begins at conception and all of the implications for reproduction and science that then threatens? Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So after Georgia's abortion restrictions were passed, and even in the process of the hearings for this legislation, right, we had doctors coming to the Capitol telling us, look, this was going to lead to a lot of confusion and potentially a lot of very dangerous healthcare situations for women. So many pregnancies, wanted pregnancies, and tragically in the emergency room. And so many doctors told us that there was a real risk that women would go to the emergency room, say with the placental abruption, say with, you know, with a miscarriage happening. They could be going into sepsis. They could be bleeding out. But if that fetus has a heartbeat, these emergency physicians were very, very concerned about what they might be able to do. I received an email from a constituent this week who tragically lost a pregnancy at 17 weeks and was bleeding in an emergency room here in Metro Atlanta because the fetus still had a heartbeat, and they were trying to figure out when her health was going to be on the precipice to the point where they felt like they could act without repercussion. Now, the sponsors of this legislation and some of the folks in the majority party have said, no, the exceptions, they're clear. No doctor should worry about this. But we know the reality is that doctors are deeply concerned. And we have placed a barrier between the doctors and the patients and the life-saving care that women need. So when we talk about the laws, yes, there are exceptions that are written into the current code in Georgia, but we know that the reality is that there is a lot of murkiness for the actual medical professionals who are on the ground in our emergency rooms and in our doctors' offices trying to help women and help, frankly, save their lives. I know that physicians right now are working on trying to bring clarifying language to the General Assembly so that hopefully we can pass things that do make it more clear so doctors have less doubt about how they're able to care for their patients without risking their own freedom, right? I mean, you've got a doctor, first do no harm. They're trying to protect their patients, but they also don't want to risk being arrested and put into jail, right? I mean, this is a real thing. So yeah, there are exceptions and things that are written in our law, but we know the reality is that there is a real murkiness and a real hesitation amongst a lot of physicians, and that is life-threatening for Georgia women.
I will just add to that. Without a clear statement of what your right is, you're not only creating murkiness for the physicians, but for people, those that are trying to plan their families, those who are lawyers, but also most people, the vast majority of which will not have time to read the code or the Constitution or case law on wrongful death, wrongful life, etc. That is what Dobbs unfortunately has created, is uncertainty, not only with respect to, it's created some certainties, unfortunately, but it's created a lot of uncertainties that impact not only the physicians, but ultimately the patient and the people. So I did want to say that as well.
Great point.
Can I add one footnote
ahead,
to
Senator.
this?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Nan Orrock, State Senate 36 District. Believe them when they tell you what they're going to do.
Right.
And that's what we're seeing. I remember years ago when the U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania stated we have to stop this contraception. And it was jaw-dropping to hear that out of a mouth. But the take-home lesson is politicians and judges are not gynecologists, but they're behaving as though they are. And years ago in the Health and Human Services Committee, there was an effort to block access to fertilization services of medical experts. And this capital was flooded. This capital was flooded with families bringing their children or their children's photographs that were a result of in vitro fertilization. And at that point in time, years ago, 78,000 Georgia families had taken advantage of this medical option. 78,000. There's no telling how that number has grown at this point. So I say to the GOP, if you want to make this move in Georgia, be prepared, because you're going to be overwhelmed with opposition from Georgians who know better how to control and their access to medical services and reproductive choice. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Did you get your question answered?
Oh, I was just going to ask, what's the next? I know you made the filing on yesterday. What is the next steps in this process?
Well, what I would like is to, and I'll let Representatives Anulowicz and Lim answer as to the House. What I would like in the Senate is to, we could have a hearing. That's the first step, is requesting a hearing. However, as stated previously, the best and most effective way to move the legislation is we'll look for other health care bills where this could come through the process, because under our rules there isn't time to have it move as a standalone. But we can move it as quickly as tomorrow on crossover day. If Republicans want to join with us in the state Senate to reassure Georgians that they have access to family planning tools that have been the standard of care for decades and fundamental rights for generations, they will hasten to do that tomorrow.
I want to kind of piggyback to what Raul said. I know that in the heartbeat law were references to personhood, that unborn children are persons, and then I think they use that to give tax breaks. And I know that's kind of a gray area. I mean, could someone use that gray language to go to the Georgia Supreme Court, much like what happened in Alabama?
I think they absolutely could. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? I mean, that would be my perspective. I agree with what my colleagues said about the murkiness that exists, and it's on purpose. It's on purpose, right? Right? The making it confusing, making it sweeping, having conflicting clauses in there is all on purpose, because the true goal are the things that we are raising up today to say, be concerned about this.
I will just echo that. Yes, they absolutely could. While were I the lawyer on the other side, would make a variety of different arguments as to why they would be incorrect, the problem starts in the fact that you are creating that uncertainty at all. So I think, again, even regardless, as important as the substantive right is, and the binary that is this right protected or not, the uncertainty is as much of the problem. The fact that someone could even bring a case and not, any of us in this room could 100% say that claim would be denied, that would be dismissed on a motion to dismiss something early in the process, and that would not cost the state, or whomever being sued, the physician, thousands and thousands of dollars in attorney's fees. The fact that we can't answer that in this certainty, yes, now, is the problem.
I just want to add that Georgians need to know that OBGYNs are leaving states with restrictions. Yeah, right. We don't want to practice this way. We've taken oaths to take the best care of our patients, to respect their autonomy and privacy. I was in that 481 room before it was passed, and we warned that this would happen. Now we have data.
Right.
OBGYNs don't want to practice this way. We don't want to ask how sick enough is the patient for us to intervene. We want to do what we were trained to do. And we should be allowed to do that without this kind of interference.
Here.
Yeah, and I'll just, and to what the doctor said, remember, we are already a state where more than half of our counties do not have an OBGYN. And we are already a state with staggeringly high maternal mortality rates. Have we tried to address that as a General Assembly? Yes, but we have not gone far enough. And the bottom line is, if you are creating an environment where gynecologists are afraid, or obstetricians and gynecologists are afraid to practice their medicine in our state, that is harmful for women. And we will never get rid of our very high maternal mortality rate and infant mortality rate if we are chasing doctors out of our state.
We could take one more if anyone has any. You get everybody?
I'll take it, no one else.
Go ahead, Rob.
Any comment on what's happening in Alabama, specifically the legislation that they're putting out there is the idea of criminal and civil immunity.
Right,
for
right,
IVF
yeah, it's a total
providers.
form, not, yeah.
Is that approach or any comments on that?
Well, I'll just quickly say that I have not read that legislation. But my impression is they are taking more of a tort reform approach, which then may give the doctors some certainty, which, of course, as Dr. Zeman has testified just now, we know is very important. But what I noticed is they are not frontally attacking. They do not want to have to say that a frozen embryo is not a child. So they're trying what they can do to come up with another way around it. And I think that's very telling.
I'm aware of the legislation. I have not fully read it, but I will say the defense of something is not the same as affirmatively protecting a right. And the defense will never be as good in addressing what rights exist and addressing any possible certainty or uncertainty will never be as good as an affirmative statement as to the right. And again, this is why they're attacking it from a different angle. No, we have not read the legislation, but the fact that it's about an affirmative defense or a defense rather than an affirmative right is the problem.
And meanwhile, women's lives are on the line, right? The gears of justice, regardless of whether you have a defense in place, the gears of justice grind slowly. And we know in Alabama right now, there are women who had been going through the IVF process who have now had to completely put that process on hold. No regard from their General Assembly, from their Supreme Court, to what that means for their bodies. No regard, physically for their bodies with the process of what they're having to do to prepare their wombs for that transfer, right? No regard. So, yeah, there can be litigation, and that litigation can ultimately result in those protections. But meanwhile, women, real actual women, are the ones who are going to pay the price, potentially with their lives.
That's right. Absolutely. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for your attendance, for shining a spotlight on these critical topics related to reproductive care. Appreciate you very much.